The English Jueju is a poem made of 4 lines. Each line includes 5 or 7 monosyllabic words. The lines follow a set thematic progression and end with an AA-BA rhyme scheme. However, there is much more to English Jueju than these simple rules indicate. A successful English Jueju must be both poetic and harmonious, and in this tradition, that means a poem must have li yi as well as wen dao. Li yi is a term used to describe a classical Chinese poem's core poetic meanings, its theme, tone, and overall feeling. Wen dao refers to the pattern of the poem following the patterns of heaven and earth, its harmony, rhythm and rhyme, parallelism of the meaning, as well as parallelism of the sound. The li yi, or theme of a poem, reveals how a poet sees the world, and, in return, we see his or her own inner nature. The Chinese imperial examination system believed poetry could not only reveal one's intelligence and sensitivity, but also one's originality and gracefulness. In short, classical Chinese poetry was a public mirror for one's own heart and mind.
Hello, my name is Jonathan Stalling. I am the curator of the Chinese Literature Translation Archive. I am an editor of Chinese Literature Today and an English professor here at the University of Oklahoma. And for over 20 years, I've been working on introducing a new form of poetry into the English language and into American culture. And that form is called the English Jueju. Jueju is a quatrain, a poem of 4 lines. In the beginning, I called this Tong Quatrain, but then I realized I actually really want people to know the word Jueju, and not only to know what the word means, but how to write it. To learn about it from the outside is one thing, to learn how to do it yourself is another. So I hope that we will be able to spend some time together learning how to write the English Jueju. Before we look more deeply into classical Chinese poetry, I want to take a moment to recognize that Chinese poetry is all around us. The influence of Chinese culture on American society over the last 100 years is everywhere. But it might be interesting just to hear a little bit about how that came to be. So 100 years ago, this year, a Chinese poet named Hu Shi returned to China from studying abroad in America. Now, Hu Shi came upon the work of an American poet, Ezra Pound. And Ezra Pound had initiated a revolution in American poetry, something we now refer to as imagism or modernism. And part of what he said was, we need to get rid of meter. We need to get rid of rhyme. We want to return to language of real things, of images. Show, they say, don't tell. He, that is Hu Shi, came back to China preaching this kind of revolution. But where did that revolution come from? It turns out that poet, Ezra Pound, was translating classical Chinese poetry. He saw the classical Chinese poem as an archipelago of Chinese characters, right? Like the Hawaiian Islands, each one separate from another, loosely connected to one another. Each one is a thing. He didn't see grammar there. And more importantly, he didn't hear the rhyme and the meter. Instead, he saw it as a model for breaking away from traditional American verse. So he wrote something called A Few Don'ts. Those few don'ts said, don't use meter, don't use rhyme. Instead, compose to the musical phrase, something more subtle. Well, Hu Shi revolutionized Chinese poetry for the next 100 years. But I want to again bring us back to the fact that he brought ideas from America that America learned from China. So for 100 years, Chinese poetry has been deeply influencing American poetry, but it didn't stop with poetry. The ideas of Chinese poetics and philosophy influenced a whole range of visual artists as well, modernists all the way up to the current moment. So when we look at our cell phones today, if I pulled out my iPhone and I pushed a little heart, it would say, you have 4 parts of your day you should be paying attention to. You should look at your health in terms of how many steps you're taking. But one of those 4, 25%, is called mindfulness. What is mindfulness and where did it come from? How did it become so pervasive that it's on every iPhone in America and beyond? Mindfulness was introduced also as a form of Buddhism. And Buddhism, first and foremost, found its beachhead, its primary bridge into American culture through poetry. And those poets brought not only concepts of Buddhism and mindfulness into America, but also gave us tools, that is, humans, tools for living a more peaceful and worthwhile life by taking time out, calming the mind, and trying to be present to what it offers us. It expands our human resources and makes us more efficient, but more importantly, provides us with a greater meaning and resource for our whole life. Poetry, in other words, Chinese poetry specifically, has really already impacted us. But one of the things I've always been bothered by this story is that when Ezra Pound introduced these ideas, he did not introduce some of the fundamental concepts that make Chinese poetry Chinese. Now, you might think that, as I would, that most world literature travels around the world through translation, and that is certainly true today. Ezra Pound was translating classical Chinese poetry into English, just as in previous generation, Giles, for the Victorians, was translating it into English. And if we look at this book of Giles, this one is from the Chinese Literature Translation Archive, housed at the University of Oklahoma. And if we look at the book closely, we'll see some handwriting here crossing out one of the poem's titles. That poem said, "Tranquil repose." Giles had translated the Chinese into that phrase, tranquil repose. The modernist translator, Arthur Waley, he crossed that out and he put in pencil, void and tasteless. What's very interesting about this for me is that in the Victorian age, for poetry to be beautiful, they needed a word like tranquil, repose. But in the modernist age, we introduced concepts of Buddhism so that the English language itself transformed. Tasteless and void could now be seen in positive terms as neutral, objective, free, liberating. That's a revolution. And it's a revolution that we can see in translation. So when we're talking about translation, it's not that once you've translated it, it's done forever. Instead, every age will translate in a new way. And Chinese poetry has been translated for a few hundred years. But before it was translated, Chinese poetry moved across the world in a different way. Instead of being translated into different languages, it transformed different languages. You see, in Vietnam, for instance, we can use the word Sino-Vietnamese to describe the way that Vietnamese poets would write poetry in Chinese, even though they don't speak Chinese. In Korea, we call this Sino-Korean. For 1,000 years, Korean poets wrote classical Chinese poetry, following all those rules of classical Chinese poetry in Korean. In Japan, the same thing. Sino-Japanese poetry is Chinese poetry written in a Japanese language or mind. When they read those poems, they're thinking of those poems in their own language. But when you look at it on the page, it looks like Chinese, and it follows all of those rules. What we're going to be talking about today is how do we transform English into Sino-English. So what is Sino-English? Well, first and foremost, it is an English where we reduce all of the words to monosyllables. Monosyllables are those words with only one vowel, like cat and hat. Monosyllables are plentiful in the English language. We have well over 3,000 or 4,000 of them, and many of these come from the Anglo-Saxon, from very ancient words. And they're very easy to see, which is to say, they're very good words for poetry. And they're very similar to classical Chinese in almost every way. Classical Chinese, unlike modern Chinese, is also monosyllabic. Every Chinese poem is built with words of only one syllable. So if you want to build a classical Chinese poem, you have to get the meter right, and that meter is based on the monosyllable. So first and foremost, Sino-English is monosyllabic English. The other aspects of Sino-English are best understood in the context of the rules for classical Chinese poetry, and I'll be talking about those later. You see, translation is fine and it's really important, but classical Chinese poetry cannot easily be translated because its ideas actually are carried in the code. Not what the code represents, but the code itself. Those languages had to be transformed in order to be a conduit, in order to be a bridge for ideas of Chinese culture to spread. And why did they spread? Well, really, ideas of culture only spread when they're useful for the other people. So when you find something useful, you use it, and that's how an idea spreads. So in Vietnam, Korea, and Japan, classical Chinese poetry did something that was useful for those societies. So what was it? Well, classical Chinese poetry was first and foremost useful for the Chinese people. And before we get too far along, it's probably pretty important to note that China is a pretty diverse place. There are almost 50 minorities. These are non-Chinese ethnicities that speak different languages. But even if we look at the Han people, the Chinese ethnicity, they speak so many different accents and so many different dialects. A dialect in Chinese can be so different that we could say it's more different from Italian and Spanish or Portuguese. In many other contexts, we might call them languages. When it comes to accents, it's really hard to understand different accents of even the same dialect. So, when you think about China as an imagined space, a space where a Chinese person knows they're a part of a larger community, how was that created? How did human beings create the Chinese imaginary, the idea of Chineseness? And this is where poetry came in. Poetry was a tool that people used in order to understand how one Chinese person speaking one dialect in a very different world, that the climate is different, the food is different, the local customs are different. How is this person Chinese at the same time as someone else? And how does a nation with so many diverse peoples remain a nation at all? Why don't they break into civil war and separate into different kingdoms? And so for 2,000 years, one of the ways in which the Chinese Empire remained intact was through a testing regime, something called the imperial examination system. And at the core of that imperial exam was poetry. How to compose a poem was one of the primary skills that would have bought you entrance into higher political authority and responsibility. That's right, a poetry exam to be a ruler. So important was this exam that people would let's say you have 5 children. 4 children, if you were in a wealthy family, might have to work in the field to produce enough food to pay for that one child not to work in the field. So they need to create enough calories for the whole family to eat, minus 1. That could be quite difficult for a family without means. Now imagine you are that child studying for this poetry exam. That is not studying like we study. Imagine all of your siblings working in the field so that you and only you could study. So you study deeply and hard and long. Now let's imagine you are not a poor middle-class style family, but instead a ruling family. And you want, because you're an ambitious person and your family wants power, you must also succeed through the examination system. So you have a lot of responsibility. And that responsibility is to learn the rules so well that you become graceful, creative, original, never looking stifled by the rules. You want to be so good, you want to understand this material so well that it's completely natural. So let's imagine that one of these princelings from a kingdom in southern China or in northern China passes the exam. Great, congratulations. Now what? Those would be brought into the central government and they would likely be removed from their home and put somewhere else in the kingdom. What does that do? It means they're no longer at their home base. They can no longer raise an army there. Instead, they're somewhere else, fulfilling their aspirations to be an important person in the empire. This will keep power displaced, moving, as it were, kind of decapitating, as it were, the most ambitious, bright minds and moving them, from their family structures and moving them around the empire. And so you can start to see that poetry would be the perfect exam, because if you can write a beautiful poem, you would demonstrate that you believe in this thing called China. And what is this thing? And what does the poem show? As we'll be talking about through this lecture today, that a poem reveals one's ability to understand how the world works according to the classical Chinese worldview. That is, that the world is, and that people's role in the world are a bit different from one another. Here's an example. You could say that clouds have a certain kind of pattern that makes them a cloud, and a rock has a rock pattern that makes them a rock. But a human's pattern is a little hard to understand because you could look at a person and not know what kind of person they are. So in the classical Chinese worldview is that a person must cultivate their personness. They must, in a certain sense, learn to be a human being. And that you learn that by cultivating yourself, by drawing upon the wisdom of the ancients. And what did the ancients teach those classical Chinese people? It taught them that the world sometimes fell out of balance, and that's why we have sickness. Or sometimes a ruler may treat people unequally, and that will create chaos and conflict. So instead, rulers as well as families, or from the local government to the national government scale, should always follow the notion of balance and harmony. But in order to do that, that should come naturally from you, not as a rule at all. That should be your very nature. To do that, it means you must demonstrate gracefulness and naturalness in your balance and harmony. Now, if everyone was a musician, it would just be a music test. If you can play the zither in a way that would reveal this balance and harmony, then perhaps you could be, that would be a good test. But of course, it's unfair to make everyone a musician. But poetry was a more equal space. People of different places would be able to bring language into balance. And for the classical Chinese worldview, that means balancing the meaning of a poem and also balancing the sound of a poem. And to understand this, we will be introducing concepts like yin and yang, and we will think about things like the 5 elements and how a poetry exam or how a poetic form could reveal that you have been cultivated to the level you need in order to take on greater responsibility. So you could say that from one perspective, classical Chinese poetry is just about becoming human in a deeper, more meaningful way. And that's why, personally, I find teaching and writing in this form so wonderful and something I've enjoyed doing for over 20 years. But from another perspective, it could help us gain insight into how the Chinese historical narrative works, how and why China looks the way it does. It gives us a window into deep Chinese culture and helps us understand even politics better. So I hope you'll join me as we go a little bit further into these concepts of Li Yi and Wen Dao. Li Yi being what makes a poem poetic in Chinese, and Wen Dao, how do we bring our language and ourselves into harmony with the Tao, with the path, with nature itself. Poetry will give us both the beauty of poetry and the pattern and harmony of nature.
To best reveal one's highest self through a classical Chinese poem, one must first master the rules. Li Yi. Rule number 1. Li Yi first and foremost results from one's ability to blend the natural world, or Jing, with one's inner emotion, or Qing. The first 2 lines introduce the Jing, or the natural setting. The first line is called Qi, and it introduces the natural scene. The second line is called Zheng, and it deepens and extends the Jing, or natural setting. The third line is called Zhuan, and it transitions the poem toward Qing, the poet's interior feeling. The fourth line is called He, and it brings and combines the Jing, or nature, and Qing, feeling, into a final conclusion, or Yuanhe. Wen Dao. Rule number 2. Follow the proper form. Number 1. Use only monosyllabic words. Second, include only 5 or 7 monosyllabic words on each line. 3. Group your words into units or groupings. 2 together, then 2 together, and then 3 together. For example, cold stones, clear streams, late noon shade. Try to sequence words so that they connect meanings inside each grouping more than they do between the groupings. Stones and clear do not follow as well as cold stones, for instance. 4. End the lines with the rhyme scheme AABA. Because the Jueju form does not have many words, the end rhymes become a very powerful part of the overall sound of the poem. Try not to rhyme words in any other position in the poem. By following level 1 and 2 rules, you can write an unregulated Jueju, which is best for beginners.
So as we move into classical Chinese poetry, in Chinese or in English, we're going to be talking a lot about 2 fundamental concepts, the concept of the natural world, or Jing, and the concept of the subjective or inner world, which is Qing. And so Li Yi, which is the poetryness of poetry, is different in the classical Chinese tradition than it is in the West. In the West, we might use metaphors as one of the primary engines that really makes a poem poetic. So her lips are a butterfly. It's a strange mashup, actually, but it is what makes a poetic line poetry. In China, though, it's different. It's this relationship between the natural world, again, Jing, and the internal, emotional, feeling world, or Qing, right? So these are 2 concepts we will be talking more about. Jing, the setting, and it is usually the natural world. and Ching, which is this feeling. We could also call this emotion. Okay, Ching is a kind of a CH sound when written in the pinyin system in China. Okay, so Jing and Ching. So I want to pull back for a moment and try to explain why are these two things so important. And to do that, I'm going to do what my students make fun of me for doing, which is to draw a really terrible picture. So when we look out of our eyes, we look out windows. Okay. What we see out there is determined in part by how we're feeling in here. So let's say outside the window, we see a mountain, we see a stream, we see a tree. Okay. This will be the first line of a Chinese classical poem. It's just setting the scenery. Now, the second line might focus in on something there, deepen it, extend it. The job of the second line is to explore that natural world a little bit more deeply. And so we have that mountain, we have a stream, we have something like a tree. Let's look at that tree now. That tree is here. And let's say this tree has a few buds on it. It's springtime. Now, if I left you with just those two lines, you would probably expect that the poem would be about rebirth or something positive because spring has that feeling in it. And that might very well be true. It likely is true. But the third line of a poem might introduce an unexpected emotion. For instance, what if the poet had lost a child or their lover or their mother or father? So maybe they're experiencing some kind of loss, homesickness, or grief. Now, how does it feel to see rebirth? Actually, it might sting a little more. The beauty out in the outward space, as it's juxtaposed with your own emotion, could really heighten that emotion. And so now, rather than looking at a beautiful world, we're looking at some world tinged with human emotion. Let's switch it around. Let's imagine those leaves are now falling. All right, and they're on the ground, or a little bit of snow or something like that. Now that world is barren. There are no birds calling, or singing. You just have this barren world. That might look, especially when we zoom in on that tree, that we'll be talking about growing old or age or grief or loss or something like that. But what if the third line introduced a hand pouring a cup of hot or warm tea? And that is your mother or father, your lover, your child, or something like that, right? Now all of a sudden, that external world is warmed by the human sentiment. And in fact, the coldness of it is what heightens our feeling of belonging to someone, with someone, right? That sense of warmth is extended and deepened by this external world. So the external world is always framed by the inner world. You could say that the external world is a scene, but there is no scene ever that is not first seen. So our understanding of the world is limited to how we understand the world. In other words, there is no world that is not seen through human eyes. There could be no knowledge or no experience of the outer world that isn't experienced from within this inner world, nor could we really express our inner world without reference to our context, to our environment, right? And so they are not separate from one another. And that is the deep wisdom of classical Chinese poetry, and how and why, when we read a really good poem, we feel at the end that we've benefited in some deep spiritual sense. We've learned of the oneness of the universe and our place within it. And that seems grand, and in fact it is grand. Classical Chinese poetry carries a heavy weight for culture. It produces and maintains deep ideas through time. And that's why people read poems 2,000 years old, still relishing them as if they were written yesterday. Universal, timeless ideas. Jing and Ching. So as we look at an example, maybe the most famous example of a Chinese poem, we'll be looking at this poem by Li Bai. And this, believe it or not, is, I warned you, I'm a terrible artist. This is a picture of a bed, and this is Moonlight in a bed. The most famous Chinese poem, every Chinese student will have memorized this poem. I memorized the poem myself when I was 13, and it's a really great example of an unregulated Tang poetry poem, or Jueju. So let's read it and let's talk about this poem in relationship to the Jing, right, that we've been talking about, right, the scene, and the Ching, the emotion. Okay, so we start the poem. 船前明月光. That's the first line. Moonlight falls near bed. Okay, so that established this scenery or the setting of the poem. The second one, so that's called qi, right? Qi means to start the poem by establishing the setting. The next one, cheng, this means to deepen or extend that natural scene. 疑是地上霜. I doubt frost there spread. Okay, so there's something, that moonlight is falling down on the bed and on the floor. The poet, we don't really see the poet because we're inside the poet's eyes. The poet here is seeing that light and imagining that it's frost. Now, that's a little bit like a metaphor because it's, but he's denying that it's true. It's not frost. It's just moonlight. Okay, so that's the beautiful first two lines, the first couplet, setting the scene, the Jing. Okay, but then what happens? The third line will introduce a transition. It will bring forward the Qing, or the emotion of the poem. So it goes, so let's take it all together here. 船前明月光，疑是地上霜。举头望明月，低头思故乡. So 举头望明月, lift the gaze, look up, lift your head, and find or see the bright moon. Now, this is introducing the human person, okay? They're lifting their head and they're looking at the moon. The fourth line is going to complete that human emotion. 低头, put down your head, and you start feeling homesick for your homeland, for your family. So 低头思故乡, miss home, hang my head. So the English, following our patterns that we're working on, only monosyllabic words, following the Jing, Ching, and so on. Moonlight fall near bed. I doubt frost there spread. Lift gaze, find bright moon. Miss old home hang head. So it has the same sonic pattern, but it also follows the liyi of the poem, right? Because it's a translation, it's taking us into the emotion. So why is the moon? Moon pops up in a lot of classical Chinese poems, and it's because two people can see the same moon from very different places, right? So when you see the moon and you're away from your family, it can be a trigger for homesickness. You would imagine, what are they doing? Are they looking at the same moon? So this poem balances the human emotion of missing home with a natural setting. Now, if we just removed those second two lines and we just saw the frost on the ground or the moonlight, I wouldn't know what the emotion is. It sets the stage for the human consciousness, for a human feeling, but it doesn't complete it. That's what the Zhan and He do, the third and fourth line. So as you write your own Jueju, you'll be doing that as well. Here's one that I wrote. I wrote this in Yunnan, in southwest China. Moss hair, clouds roam, soft breeze blows. White blooms, fog stirs, clear streams flows. Hang head, dirt prints, am I here? Raise head, star specks, no one knows. First of all, I was alone when I wrote this poem, and I was inspired by this poem. Of course, it's the same structure. That middle line introduces the idea of me changing my perception. At first, I'm looking at the natural world, right? And then I'm looking in the inner world. And so the first two lines set the natural setting. The second two lines give you a feeling of introspection. Do I exist in such a beautiful world as this? When you see such a vast, beautiful world and no one else is around you, you might question your own existence. And that's the kind of feeling I felt in the majesty of this location. As I read this poem, I remember that setting and that feeling perfectly. But the beauty about Chinese poetry is that the reader becomes like the writer. the idea is that you will have a direct experience of the world because you're seeing the world through the eyes, through the frame of the poet themselves. So even 2,000 years on, people are feeling the world through Li Bai's eyes.
Wen Dao, Rule 3 and 4. These higher-level rules are for regulated Jueju, or Lu Shi, and combine the beauty of poetry with the game qualities of crossword or Sudoku puzzles. Wen Dao, Rule 3. Parallel and anti-parallel meanings. Write the first 2 lines so that the words in each position echo the meaning of the words above and below. Dark night, dim stars, fresh fog drifts, gray dusk, pale moon, crisp haze shifts. In line 3, the words in the same vertical positions below will be antithetical to the meanings above. Clear day, flushed skin, worn thoughts still. When viewed vertically, we see columns of matching nouns with nouns, adjectives with adjectives, and verbs to verbs. The first 2 lines reveal a similarity. The third line reveals a difference.
Classical Chinese parallelism is based on the philosophy of yin and yang and 5-element theory. I'll talk about yin and yang later because when we talk about sound, it's about alternating between yin sound and yang sounds. But when we talk about meaning, it's more complicated than that. So let me tell you a little bit about how the 5-element theory works and how and why it will come into poetry to make it more beautiful, to lift it up and make it an engine to teach deep Chinese cultural ideas. Okay, so let us begin with, for instance, wood. Okay, so we have the wood element, and then wood will create fire. Fire will create earth. Earth will create water. Oh, sorry. Metal, actually. Right? Metal, through condensation, will create water. And water will create wood. So how is that, right? So wood, of course, you can burn wood, so it becomes the substrate or the substance of fire. Fire, through volcanoes, produce earth. Earth, of course, is where we find minerals like metal. Metal, through condensation, produces water. And water, of course, is what we get wood from. Now, it's too simplistic to think of the world broken down into these 5 things. So maybe the word element here is misleading. You know, you've seen the table of elements, right? This is not the same thing. Instead, many people will translate this as phases. And it means like things that have the characteristics of. So things that have a characteristic of fire. There's multiple processes that might be described as fire, things that are like earth, earth-like, metal-like, and so on, right? Waterish, etc. Okay, so all of these are the 5 basic components. They will have a creative cycle, but they will also have a destructive cycle. Wood will overcome earth. Earth holds or overcomes water. Water overcomes fire. Fire overcomes metal. Metal overcomes wood. All right, so they exist in a balance where they're never in one state for very long. They're either causing another state to take place, or they're destroying that state, causing another state to happen. So this is not meant to be anything more than a snapshot of abstract ideas. The most important thing for poetry is to understand that the classical Chinese worldview would organize things into 5s. Part of this could be the hand itself. And so when it comes to linguistics, the hand, right? I'll do my hand here. A hand would be something we could talk about the 5 notes of the pentatonic scale of music. We can talk about it as the 5 elements. We can also talk about it as the 5 places in your mouth that you make consonant sounds. And so back in the Tang Dynasty, a lot of information would have been coded in this system. So if you were applying for a job in the Chinese government, and the Chinese government wanted to understand, did you understand Chinese philosophy and cosmology? Do you know how the world works? What kind of diagnostic could you run? Well, this is the same engine, the same concepts that run medicine, but it's hard to give an exam to see whether or not one understands five-element theory through medicine, right? So if you go to a Chinese doctor, they're going to ask you to put out your hand. You'll put your hand out and they'll put their fingers on your blood vessels here, and they're going to listen, not for a beat, but they're going to be gauging your qi flow, the flow of energy in your body, and they will be able to tell you whether or not you are missing one element or another element. Each of these elements have more or less yin and yang in them, right? So fire has a lot of yang, water has a lot of yin. If your body has too much fire, they're going to prescribe to you medicine that will have a lot of water element in it. That will balance your body. If you have acne, for instance, they would call this fire because it's a kind of fire energy in your body, and they would prescribe something that would calm that down, and that would be a watery substance. Okay, so that would be very cool, but totally not likely because, you know, how would you test whether or not someone really gets it right, right? You would see this in city planning, like feng shui. You might be familiar with this idea. You can see it in governance and how you govern, but you can't give someone a job and then test and see how they do, right? So how can you test if someone really understands these ideas? Poetry will be one of these places where you can kind of show that you understand things belong in different categories. Categories relate to one another in different ways. And so when we build a classical Chinese poem, we're going to be thinking about words as being something like things, and think of poetry as being something like alchemy, where the poet is literally organizing material, the material of the world, into different relationships to bring that into harmony. If you can harmonize language, again, you harmonize the mind, the heart. From that, your family, your town, province, and so on. So it's, again, proving that you have the capacity for moral cultivation and responsibility. So let's look at some categories right now. There are 24 categories. And let's take a look over here, and I'll show you how an English word might fit into those categories. So when Chinese poetry works with parallelism, what it's doing is it's taking all of the different Chinese words and putting them into different categories. Traditionally, there are up to 24 categories. For instance, there are word categories for celestial bodies. That would include in English words like the sun, or stars, or wind, moon, and so on. Seasonal, this could be the time of day. It could also be weather. It could talk about seasons, of course, summer and so on, but anything that has to do with a kind of meteorological phenomenon, that would be a seasonal word. For geography, we might have a word like shore, or wave, or land, coast, and so on. For architecture, we have a word like gate. For instruments, these are human instruments like lamps or fans. For food, we could use the English word wheat or tea. Down here in the flora and fauna, we could have flora could be pine or fruit or stem, seed, bough. For fauna, animals, fish, lark, cows, lambs. Body parts, hair, skin. Emotions like calm or tense. So all of these words will be in parallel with one another, but sometimes they'll be a positive parallel, they'll be similar to one another. Sometimes they could be oppositional and an antithetical relationship, like a hill and a valley, but they're still in the same category. And classical Chinese poetry will build a poem that harmonizes the categories of the meanings of the words within the poem. So when we apply these categories to poetry, it'd be something like this. So let me get this out of the way, and we get a parallel poem. Here, the poem, the cards have been placed on the game board. Here, the word new and fresh, they're parallel with one another, but old is kind of anti-parallel or opposite. Rain and dew, parallel. Dust, opposite. Grass and bloom, parallel. Husk, sort of anti-parallel. Green and blue, these are cool colors. and red is a warm color. This one's not perfectly parallel, but June and Moon are celestial. Sun is also celestial, so they're all in the same category. You'll notice a number of things here. The first is that all of the words belong to the same part of speech, nouns and nouns, adjectives to adjectives, and they also belong to the same category. And the more subtle alternation between positive parallelism and negative parallelism is something you can develop over time. The English Jueju has 4 lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, and if you're doing a parallel verse, you're going to be taking this line and making this one parallel, 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 parallel for a 5. So these are going to be similar words. The third line will be anti-parallel, but they're going to be in the same category with one another. Okay, so they're going to be in the same category, but they're going to be like mountains and hills over here, and then valleys down here, right? They're going to be something like sky and clouds. They're going to be something else natural, but maybe it's going to be water or a stream or something that's not in the sky, right? So there's going to show this relationship. The reason I did that is I wanted the English poetry, English Jueju composer or poet to be able to prove that they understand this sort of relationship of similarity and dissimilarity. It is different than synonyms and antonyms. And I really want to take a moment to explain that difference because I think it's quite an interesting aspect of this poetic genre. And then I'll talk a little bit about why I've moved beyond this concept by introducing parallelism of sound. So when we think about opposites in English, we usually think about antonyms, and when we think about similarities, we'll think about synonyms. And you can actually go to a thesaurus and it will organize English into these 2 different categories. But when it comes to thinking about 5-element theory and how things relate to one another, I think it introduces a different way of imagining English. So let me give you an example. So we might say that cloud is similar to mist. Right? They are, for the most part, the same thing, except where you might find them, clouds are higher, mist is lower. But if we put drizzle here, then these 2 are more similar to one another than cloud. In my mind, cloud is it's not something I would encounter with my hands. Could encounter these 2. So in a certain sense, by putting these 2 together, I actually understand the difference more between these 2. Otherwise, I would imagine that they were the same. But I add something else, and I start to understand that it's different. Let me give you another example. Let's say you're in American high school, or maybe junior high would be even better. You're at lunchtime. You have 2 tables here. You have the theater kids here, and you have maybe the athletic kids here. I know they could be interrelated, but let's say that they're sitting down with their friends and they're kind of grouped up around subcultures or interests. Okay, we could populate this room with all sorts of, the gamers over here, maybe band members here. Okay, something like that. Now, they would all imagine they're sitting in those different arrangements because they understand they're different from one another, very distinct. What happens when a teacher walks in the room? Now they're all students. What happens when a lizard walks in the room? Do they all become humans? No. So what's interesting is that within this world of parallel and anti-parallel words, we can actually say that when a piece of dust comes into the room, it is not similar enough to those students to reveal their studentness, their commonality. A lizard as well. It's too different, too far away. So it's not a good match. It's not in the same category, okay? But a teacher is in the same category, right? And so we can kind of create parallel positive and negative parallelism within the same category. They're all humans, but we can say that there's a fundamental difference between the teacher, which is older, and all of the students. Despite their smaller differences, now they are the same. And so we can understand sameness and difference not based on intrinsic qualities, but on context and contingency. In other words, things are not made out of stuff that can be identified every time in the same way, no matter what the situation is. Instead, the whole universe is made out of things that only take meaning in relationship to something else. Everything is relational. and not pigeonholed into these essences, right? And when we understand that, we're really starting to move into Chinese cosmology or Chinese medicine. Things are not exactly one thing. They're always relating to one another, and they're always dynamic. And so I invented this idea of anti-parallel parallel inside the English Jueju because it's an easy way for an American student or an English speaker to introduce that they understand the relationship between yin and yang and this idea of a category and how things become meaningful in context. All right, so as we move forward, I'll give you some more examples of parallel verse from some of the winners of the Jueju competition. But then as we move on to sound, we'll see that just like the Dui Lian that I began with, where you have two lines, parallel in meaning, but antithetical in sound. Once I learned that English had yin and yang tones in them, which I'll explain in a moment, then I realized actually we can follow all of the rules of classical Chinese poetry. I did not need to really introduce additional rules to get the idea through. So in this year's competition, we're actually introducing a new level, and that new level is the level of harmonizing the sound of words. And as we do that, you're welcome to continue to do the parallel and anti-parallel Jueju in the competition, but you could also try out this new form of parallelism where we show the parallel, anti-parallel of sound.
Wen Dao, Rule 4. Parallel in antithetical sound. Monosyllabic English and Classical Chinese are roughly split between long and short vowel sounds. Long vowel sounds are words that end in a vowel, sky, flaw, who, bay, or end in voiced consonants. They're called ping, lab, dad, lag, jazz, rave, lathe, age. Short vowel sounds, on the other hand, end in unvoiced consonants and are called z, lap, tat, tack, lass, laugh, latch, path. English speakers are not taught this distinction because native speakers do not need to know the rule to produce the sound correctly, but writing English Jueju at this level requires one to hear it. Once you learn how to distinguish these vowel lengths, you are ready to restore harmony by following the same patterns as classical Chinese poets. Cold wind, short branch blows, brisk gust, dense limb flows, warm drops, wide eyes mist, new storm sweeps dust slow. When one can create a beautiful poem while following all of these rules, one would have passed the most difficult level of the Tang Dynasty imperial examination. Your poem's Li Yi would reveal you to be a true Jinshi, a scholar poet the emperor could entrust with the responsibilities of governing.
So in this section, we're going to be talking about Wen Dao again, but in this case, we're not talking about parallelism of the meaning. We're going to be talking about parallelism of the sound. And in classical Chinese poetry, that means we're going to be balancing vowel lengths. So let's get an example to really give you a good feeling for what this sounds like. So here's a poem by the poet Hanyu. He's really well known for how well he follows the rules of sound parallelism. So here it goes. 新年都未有芳华，2月初惊闲草芽，白雪却嫌春色晚，孤穿庭树作废花。 Now, that could also be chanted in a more like a song, also following the same rhythms or the same tones. 新年都未有芳华，2月初惊闲草芽，白雪却嫌春色晚，孤穿庭树作废花。 So for the English ear, it's a bit difficult to know what is the pattern that we're hearing here. But by, I think, the next 3 or 4 minutes, at the end of that, we'll have a very good idea about how this poem balances the yin and yang of sound. So what do we mean by the yin and yang? Well, you've probably seen this famous symbol t-shirts, tattoos, and so on. Something like this. A circle with 2 tadpoles in it and 2 eyes. Now, usually the one that's going down will be dark, and the one that's coming up will have a dark eye. Something like this. So imagine that this represents lightness, a kind of light, dry, and so think of it as air. It's going to move up naturally, like a helium balloon. It's going to rise. This is wet and dark. It's naturally going to follow gravity and go down. But like a lava lamp, as this moves up and tilts over the center point, the pupil will start dilating, and that darkness will start growing and grow heavier, and then it's going to spin down. The same thing here, that lightness is going to expand, and eventually it will take over and it will lift it up. This is always moving. In fact, a more accurate depiction might be something that's all gray. You can't see anything at all because it's always moving. So this is just a static snapshot of how nature works, alternating between a dynamic relationship, not of opposites, but of 2 related forces. So that is called yin, which is the dark, and yang. So how does a poem reveal the pattern of harmony that balances the yin and yang of sound like Hanyu did? To do this, we have to switch over to English now. So how did Hanyu produce this balance between yin and yang in the sound of his poem? The answer actually begins before Hanyu lived. It goes all the way back to a little after the Han Dynasty, and so we're 4th, 5th century AD. And there was a prince by the name of Shen. He was one of the first converts in China to Buddhism, and he had practiced Buddhism with monks that came from India, and they were learning Sanskrit. And as they studied the Sanskrit language, they had to learn Sanskrit linguistics. And part of that training required them to think about the Chinese language differently because they were introduced to new concepts like vowels and consonants. Before the introduction of Buddhism to China, that distinction was unnecessary. There was no reason to know it. But as they studied mantra, the kind of chanting practice, and became familiar with these ideas, Shen started to hear something no one else had heard before. He started to hear that Chinese had tones. Maybe everyone knew this, but no one had really thought about it because there's no use for that knowledge. But he started hearing that tones were sometimes short, made the vowel short, and sometimes it made them long. Well, if you're a Chinese literati, a scholar in China, you would have been very familiar with the idea of yin and yang. So if you heard that language is broken up into different kinds of sounds, maybe there were yin sounds and yang sounds. If you wanted to, as you would apply Chinese philosophy to other things like cooking or city planning, martial arts, medicine, you could also apply it to poetry, which is to say, it is your job to bring harmony to the world. You either harmonize in your art, or you harmonize your food, you harmonize the body and medicine, and you need to harmonize language. So you need to bring a balance between yin and yang. You don't want too much yin, or there could be a problem. Too much yang is the same problem. So how do you bring it into balance? Well, all of a sudden, it was important to know what are tones, which words have this tone, which words have that tone, and then one could actually bring them into harmony and create a balance in language itself. The organization of the Chinese tones for the sake of composing Chinese poetry became known as the Rian Table tradition. This tradition became popular in the Tang Dynasty around 600 AD and continued for well over 1,500 years into the 20th century. A rhyme table provided a poet with everything they needed to know in order to produce a poem that alternated properly between yin and yang tones. A rhyme table would be useful in ancient China since everyone spoke a different dialect of Chinese. How do you rhyme, as it were, a poem if everyone spoke the language differently? A rhyme table pointed everyone to a transcendental idea of language, one language that rhymed for everyone in the same way. You would never speak this language with your mouth, but you would write it with your pen. This idea of rhyming is central to Chinese philosophy, aesthetics, and even political ideology. For rhyming is a wonderful way of thinking about resonance. When things resonate together, they are in harmony. If a poet wants to harmonize oneself with the world or with the Tao or with heaven, the place to do that is in the rhymes. And so Chinese poetry puts a strong emphasis on rhyming, not just in the sense of English rhyming, but rhyming properly between yin and yang as well. Now, the rhyme tables were recreated in the University of Oklahoma in the Poetics of Invention exhibition, which ran during the year of 2017 to 18. And you can visit the website at www.poeticsofinvention.ou.edu. There you can explore the 8 rooms of the exhibition, which follows English from the Tang Dynasty to the Song Dynasty to the Qing Dynasty all the way to today. You'll see how the English Jueju follows from all of the rules of early Chinese linguistics and finally into the apps that we've created at the University of Oklahoma that actually teach English through Chinese characters. The exhibition explores the relationship between technology and culture and shows how ancient technologies can bridge modern languages. But because this is a different topic, I'm going to go ahead and return us now to Shen Yue and his rules, which preceded the rhyme tables, for how to produce a beautiful, harmonized, classical Chinese poem. And so Shen Yue created what were the first kind of poetry rules for balancing sound of Chinese. He came up with 8 rules. These 8 rules are something we're not going to talk about in depth, but something like ping tou means if you start a poem with a yang tone, then you need to follow a certain pattern. If you start a poem with a yin vowel tone, you would need to follow a different pattern, right? This will tell you what you need to know in order to harmonize language. Okay, so I've already gave you the symbol of yin and yang. Often in Chinese poetry manuals, you will see 3 different symbols: black symbols, empty symbols, and a little target, which have both. This, as I mentioned before, the dark is yin. This is yang. And this is both. Or it means it can be either one. So for most of my life, when I would see a rhyme table or one of these kind of rhyme patterns, it would always make me very nervous because they look quite complicated. But really, they're not. When you see an empty circle, it means you should use a yang vowel. And when you see a dark circle, you should use a yin vowel. So in the poem we just heard by Hanyu, he was using this pattern. Okay, and so he followed that, and that is why the poem sounded as beautiful and as melodic as it did, because it followed that particular sound structure. So let's take a little deep dive for a moment to really get a good idea about what we mean by yin and yang vowels, not in the abstract, but in a really specific examples. So to do that, we can leave Chinese altogether, but I'll give you one example of Chinese before we start looking at how English breaks down into yin and yang vowels. In Middle Chinese, it was possible for words to have a consonant at the end of the word. And you can imagine a K or a P, for instance. If you have a word T pronounced T-E-A, like tea, it would be a long vowel, T. But if you put an unvoiced consonant at the end, listen what happens. Teek, teek, tea, teep, tea, right? So you start to hear that there's a big difference between the two. So you could say that the first 3 vowels, first 3 tones, would not have a consonant at the end. So it would just be long. And they would look something like this on a sonogram. The vowel is quite wide and long. And so you would have T, T, T. So all 3 of them look roughly the same, like this. But if you put a K, a P, a T, and so on at the end, it's going to look like this. The vowel is going to become much shorter. Okay, so this is what these diagrams are showing us. These are patterns between generally longer and shorter vowels. Now in Chinese, these were split into half, 50-50, because you need half yin and half yang. In Chinese, this isn't a perfect split because two of them are different, right? So these are called ping, and they mean yang. And this is called ze, and it is yin. And so we are going to see an alternation between these vowels. Now, it's actually much easier to do this in English than it is in Chinese. And so I think for all of you who are listening right now, you'll be much relieved to get the English examples. Doc, dog. You can say that out loud. Doc, dog. So you've probably not noticed before that doc is half the size of dog. So if we were to look at the sonogram, that's not a very good picture. If we were to look at the sonogram, it would be thin here, and it would look wide there. In other words, it looks exactly like Middle Chinese. And so the English language, as long as it's a monosyllable, will always split 50-50 between long and short. When we know this, when we can hear the difference, and I can I'll go ahead and give you all of the pairs real quick so you have these in the future. And of course, you can look online for these teaching resources. But T is short at the end, D is long, P, B, the K sound, the G sound, the CH sound, the J sound, the S sound, the Z sound, right? And we might be wondering, why does that happen? And that's because these are called voiced and these are unvoiced. And when a voice means you're vibrating your larynx. And so when you end a word in a vibrated larynx, it actually lengthens the vowel. So you have, tad, right? But then you would have tat. Tat, it's very short, tad. You unconsciously make it longer. So when you are creating regulated verse in English, classical Chinese poetry, you have to pay a lot of attention to the last consonant of the word. If it's voiced, it's long, it's a yang sound. If it's unvoiced, it's short, it's a yin sound. And that's it. It's actually not very difficult. And because they split 50-50, you have plenty of words to choose from to fill out these patterns. So let's do one real quick. So I have here a game board, right? And a game board, which again, you can get online. You can cut your pieces out and put them on the board. There will be a game board that will have a correct answer here, and you can cut them up and have the students use that board. So I call those a scramble board. It's the easiest way for a student or for a teacher to learn how to do this because all of the right answers are right on one board. So you just cut it up and rearrange it. But let's go ahead and look at how this works. So this is a 7-character line. So I'm going to be building one of these. So this one can be either one. So if it has a dot, it means it could be long or short. So I'll say cold and then dawn, right? Both of those are long. This one can also be either one. I'm going to do a short one. Cold dawn, frost. Now I need a short one. This dark means short, right? This is a yin. So it's going to be, I'm going to use the word dust. Now I need another short one. So I'm going to use the word vast. And so if you listen to the end of these words, right? St, t, it's not voice. There's no voice. So it's a short vowel. And then I want a long one again, right? 2 yangs here. So dry, and then sage. So it'd be long, long, and then this is short, 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 long, long. So cold dawn, frost, dust, vast, dry, sage. Now, these final rhymes in Chinese are usually always long. In English, though, I actually don't mind having it be either way. So I would need now to rhyme sage with the next age, for instance, would be a good rhyme of sage, and the page, etc. So you just go and you cut out your game pieces and you can apply them to the boards and they tell you which of the two vowels you should do. So it looks complicated on the outside, but actually once you get the game pieces in your hands, it's pretty easy. And it's all about building balance and harmony. Because remember, for the classical Chinese tradition, the mind and the heart is made of language. And you as a poet have the moral ability or ethical ability to bring balance to yourself through harmonizing your own language. When you do that, you will resonate like a tuning fork, and the people around you have the capacity to also tune themselves to resonate with this cultivated frequency. And as you do that, your family will have more harmony and more peace and happiness and prosperity. From there, the village. From there, the province. From there, the country. From there, the world. The notion of balance and resonance are core, and it is our human capacity to generate this kind of positive, harmonious vibration. And it's done first and foremost, in language, in ourselves, in a poem like this. Online, you will find a number of things that will help you either teach the Jueju to your students or learn yourself. And these include games that you can play. One of the games is to take a poem that has already been composed following all of the rules. And you can just simply cut the pieces out and give them to the students like a puzzle. And then they can put the poem together. The likelihood of them succeeding at their first try is much higher when they have all of these words that will, in fact, make a perfect poem in the end. And so I highly recommend using puzzle boards as your first demonstration or your first class exercise. And again, you can download those. In addition to those, we also have other word groups, groups of words that can be downloaded into word tiles or cards. You simply have to cut them out and put them out for the students, and they can start to experiment with these words. One of the scariest things for a student, whether they're 6 years old or 76 years old, is a blank piece of paper. And you should never put a blank piece of paper in front of a learner of the English Jueju. So many rules. So it looks so daunting from the outside, but once you put the game in front of them, the rest is easy. So if you download these word banks and cut them out, there are various games you can play. One of them is to take one of the yin and yang boards. And a yin and yang board will indicate in each position inside the board will have either a yin or a yang color. And you would put a yin or a yang vowel there. Of course, you have to watch the video to know what I'm talking about. It means short and long English vowels. And they can be, and you'll find them broken into two categories online. So you can download short vowel category as well as long vowel category. You don't have to do the work. These are already done for you. Simply print them out, chop them up, hand them to the students, and let them take care of it from there. You can also find parallelism boards. So these would be boards that are already set up in parallel. You simply cut them up like a puzzle and rearrange them so that you can learn the parallelism. And again, I highly recommend using these resources if you're teaching a whole class. And frankly, if you're just doing it yourself, I don't know why you wouldn't give it a shot. I've always found that when you take anything complicated and turn it into a game, it is, just think about, for instance, how complicated Scrabble is, or a word puzzle, or Sudoku. They are, from the outside, very abstract and very complicated. But when you sit down in front of a game, it becomes fun. Not only is it fun, it's also a little bit competitive. And classical Chinese poetry, as we're going to be talking about, was a competitive sport in a sense. And it was done as a social, something that you do in society to establish one's intelligence or creativity in relationship to others. And so having a slightly competitive element in this was why I created the Newman Prize for Jueju, because we all, again, kind of replicate the idea that Chinese poetry or poetry itself could be a diagnostic for one's creativity, intelligence, and so on. And that, of course, is also kind of a fun part of this project. So I hope you will avail yourself, use all the resources on the website, and I look forward to reading your Jueju. The University of Oklahoma is the home of world literature today. It was established back in the 1920s. In fact, is the oldest world literature magazine in all of America. That magazine has a prize called the Neustadt Prize for International Writing. It's been considered one of the most important prestigious literary prizes in America. 10 years ago, we established a new prize called the Newman Prize for Chinese Literature. This is the first prize outside of the Chinese-speaking world that recognizes the Chinese literature on a global scale. And this year we have a new winner. The winner is Xixi from Hong Kong, a poet whose work is much beloved by many generations. But in addition to the Newman Prize for Chinese Literature, we also have the Newman Prize for English Jueju. And this prize will be awarded in 4 categories: for elementary school students, for middle school students, for high school students, and for adults. And the adults are anywhere from college all the way up to retirees. And as part of this video, I'll be reading some of those past winners, as well as poems composed by OU alumni. And so as we enter another game cycle, another contest cycle, we will have 2 months to enter your poem into the competition. If you're a student, you must enter your poem through your teacher. You must hand it to your teacher. They will send it to me, and they have the information for this. And if they don't, you can provide it to your teacher. If you are a homeschooler, your parents have to be the one who submits the poem to me. On the website, you will find the email where you will submit your poem. And if you're a winner, you will win $500 for each of the categories. In addition to the prize money, you and your parent or you and your teacher will come to the University of Oklahoma, where you will receive your award from the Newmans themselves, right alongside Xixi. It's one of the most elegant evenings of the year in Oklahoma, and you will be front and center stage. We really do appreciate the work that our Oklahoma students are doing in bringing this new form of world poetry into the English language. Thousands of poems, as it were, have now been composed in this form. For my children, they, as I'm sure many of you, are familiar with haiku. But no one, at least not very many people I know, even know the word Jueju. But actually, the Japanese poetic form haiku is inspired by the Chinese form paiju. And the Chinese form is also in relation to Jueju. But in Asia, the most famous form of poetry would be the Jueju. And so by participating in this competition, you're also participating in a cultural movement to introduce these new ideas into America and into the English language. So work hard, use this video and the games that are provided online, and I wish you the best of luck. And I hope to see you here at the University of Oklahoma for the Newman Prize in March. So here are the winners for the Newman Prize for English Jueju, starting with the most recent winners in 2017. In the adult category, Lindsay Jones. She writes, "Dead leaves, stark sky, cold wind blows. Brown grass, gray clouds, chill air flows. New roots, rich land, warm earth holds. Deep down, sprouts reach, start to grow." In the high school category, the winner at 15 years old, Elizabeth Blazek. "Vast sky, sparse clouds, stars shine bright. Clear air, soft breeze, moon glows white. Swift streak, hands held, wish is cast. Brief smile, warm touch, heart grows light." In the middle school category, we have 12-year-old Jennifer Sosa, writing, "Clear air, warm breeze, white clouds gleam. Blue sky, birds sing, low, lone stream. Gray clouds, tense air, storm I see. Calm now, slight wind, it's a dream." In the elementary school category, we have 10-year-old Colby Bauman, writing, "Blue sea, bright sun, green grass grows. Sharp rocks, small clouds, calm breeze blows. New boats, old rocks, waves crash down. Sun sets, moon rise, cold sea flows." The 2015 winners of the English Jueju competition begin with the adult category winner, Nicole Emery. She writes, "Dark night, dim stars, fresh fog drifts, gray dusk, pale moon, crisp haze shifts, clear day, flushed skin, worn thoughts still, night quits, morn breaks, slow hand lifts. The high school winner, Lauren Morris, writes, sun glares, wind blows, air stirs leaves, clouds shift, sky shines, bird cuts breeze, smoke forms, grass burns, homes left bare, land gone, ash stays, fires won't cease. In the middle school category, we have Asan Mashraf, writing, bright day, clear skies, warm light shines, warm noon, calm winds, hot sun blinds, cold night, fierce shows, breath like ice, red fire warms hands, rest your mind. The elementary school winner, Morgan Brooks, writes, black comes, night falls, dark blue sky, gray clouds, slight lit, see go by. Girls jump, moist face, strong wind blows, soft breeze, lake shines, storm waves high. The 2013 winners of the English Jueju competition begins with the college winner, Spencer McCoy. Sparks drift, glints new dew, fireflies, warm breath, blue, cold walks, clothes fresh bloom, ice burns, glare-eyed blue. In the high school category, we have Casey Tsai, dark fog, low gray air, dawn gleams, teal sea glare, light rain, clear blue sky, look up, dusk swirls there. In the middle school category, we have Aliyah Elders. She writes, crisp air, frost-filled breeze, sleet gleams, ice-cloaked trees, fierce winds, strength takes lives, flakes fall, snow fills seas. And finally, in the elementary school category, we have Donovan Helterbrand, a kindergartner. At night, cold rain falls, mouse runs, big brown halls. Mouse stops, huge black door. He's scared, dark tail tall. In the summer of 2018, I took a group of OU alumni, all retirees now, through a poetry tour of Scotland, Wales, and England. And every day we spent time in nature, thinking about the world around us and trying to bring in the Jing, the natural setting, in monosyllabic English words. And then by the end of the day, all of us would produce our own new Jueju. Here are some of the examples that were written during that tour. The first is by Laura McDaniel. Sheepdog, blue skies, dry green leaves, lake stream, sea gulls, smell kelp seas, hill winds, brush limbs, close eyes, breathe, gray stone, walled fence, blue heart, free. A poem by Linda Hutchins. Hard stones, stacked tight, small gray house. Pink blooms, green ferns, hide, scared mouse. Bright sun, tall trees, find cool shade. Rock paths, head on, steps so Kraus. poem by Joe Lancaster. Green fields, grass bends, black-faced sheep. Gray roads, rock crunch, small cars creep. Bare foams, ice clinks, folks form bonds. Tall trees, blue skies, lakes so deep. A poem by Donna Cates. Sheepdog, foxgloves, bright green trees, lake, stream, walled fence, fast, cool breeze. Hills thrill, chalk, sheep, feel calm joy. Smell blooms, bells ring, hills of bees. A poem by Darlene Harris. Roads wind, cars fly, pine trees green. Boats drift, dogs yelp, stone walls seen. She looks, mind still, breeze goes by. Sheep graze, birds rest, lake blue dream. A Jueju for the Welsh Gardens. Footpath spills down, stone mossed green. Arched bridge, glass clear, sun glazed stream. Eyes close, breathe in, bee hummed glade. Such peace, such grace, few have seen. A Jueju set in Bath and the Cotswolds. Beige walls, sand stones, reach blue skies. Stacked tall, arched spires, soft hills rise. Rome's pools, warm springs, Cotswolds hills. Moon-shaped townhouse, Jane's keen eyes. And the last one, a Jueju set at Stonehenge. Welsh cut, hand pulled, dark ringed stone. Cold pile, star-lined, June sun's throne. Years pass, slabs fall, lost in dreams. None know who raised earth mossed bones.
For more about English Jueju, see the following websites, and good luck.